Good evening, everyone. My name is Isa Lampa, and I want to thank you all for joining us for guest curator Hunter Ohanian's lecture, LGBTQ History Through the Eyes of Robert Giard. I'm so grateful to the university community and to the Richmond Arts community for welcoming me during my first 3 months here as director of University Museums. It was a great pleasure to discover upon arrival that my very first project here would be to help realize Hunter's vision for a show of Robert Giard's portrait photographs of 20th century leaders from the LGBTQ rights movement in the United States. And as Hunter knows well from decades of leadership in the arts, exhibition making is a collaborative process involving a great many hands and voices working behind the scenes. So in that spirit, I'd like to thank, first of all, former interim director Elizabeth Schlater for inviting Hunter to bring his exhibition to the Joel and Lila Harnett Museum of Art, Stephen Duggins for hanging, installing, and lighting the galleries, John Steele for the exhibition's graphic design, Martha Wright and Casey Butler for their work on the LGBTQ education room adjacent to the exhibition galleries, Heather Campbell for programming and events, the University Communications team for helping us spread the word, and our wonderful colleagues and partners in the Maudlin Center. Huge thanks to Hunter for this extraordinary show. Queer Pioneers, which is in the galleries, and we hope to see you there later on this evening, is in many ways a model for the kind of exhibition that truly belongs in a university art museum. It's grounded in original scholarly research. It situates the viewer precisely in time, place, and culture, refining our sense of our own place in the human story. It's rooted in partnerships with people and organizations both on campus and off. It connects directly with the university curriculum and serves as a space for interdisciplinary learning and dialogue, not only within the study of art and art history, but also with the fields of visual culture, gender and sexuality studies, American studies, and legal, literary, and political history. And finally, it speaks most urgently to our values of equity and inclusion. To help me introduce our speaker tonight and to frame the significance of this exhibition, I'd like to invite to the podium Julieta Singh, Professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Stephanie Barnett-Smith, Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Thank you.
Hello. It's nice to see you all here. Isa, thank you so much for welcoming me, and I want to formally and publicly welcome you to the university. I know you're being welcomed over and over again, but I feel like there's never too much. It's not only an honor, but a real pleasure to be here tonight to hear Hunter Ohanian animate the stunning exhibit, Queer Pioneers, LGBTQ History Through the Photographs of Robert Giard. Before I introduce you to Hunter and his fascinating professional trajectories, I'd like to say something about the exhibition's presence here at UR, what it means to our queer and feminist community, and what it signals about the past and the future of our collective study of marginalized but no less revolutionary histories in and beyond this country. I am, as many of you know, and as Isa has just announced, the newly appointed Stephanie Bennett-Smith Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UR. And my appointment comes at a moment in WGSS program history in which we, as a community, are looking back at where we've been in order to imagine our futures. We are so deeply indebted to many individuals who have recently retired, Liddell McWhorter, Holly Blake, Lucretia McCulley, to name just a few. And as we continue to pay tribute to our own institutional pioneers and their legacies here at UR, it is also a moment in which we are reimagining what old paths we have wandered away from and what new paths we might begin to tread. It is at this crucial moment of institutional reckoning and dreaming that we have been gifted by coincidence and perhaps also by some kind of queer divine intervention with a truly exceptional visual history of some of America's most vital queer vanguards. As we face the brutal fact that women and queer citizens are having our basic human rights repealed, the act of returning to our activist legacies is not only vitally important, it is nothing short of life-giving and life-saving. When I wandered casually into the soft opening of Queer Pioneers over lunch last week on the first day of classes, I was immediately overwhelmed not only by the photographs themselves, which are rich and nuanced, which bring us into the intimate spheres of queer political life, but by the activist, literary, and legal histories that they collectively summon. I could say a great deal about how central so many of these individuals represented in Giard's photographs are to our study of queer and feminist theory at UR, Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, Gloria Anzaldúa, Urvashi Vaid, to name just a few, or to our study of the still all too undertold radical organizing initiatives of the AIDS crisis, or to our knowledge of the history of queer publishing and literary world-making of the 20th century. But what I really want to say tonight is that in these intimate portraits, we see how these queer individuals, as passionate and dedicated outsiders to mainstream America, become world-giving creators. And we see how this queer creation, whether through the founding of political organizations or the writing of essays, poems, and novels, changes the texture and feel of everyday life for the collective. This is an archive of queer passion, queer commitment, and queer communal life. And for all of us, regardless of how we might identify, this exhibition is a gorgeous reminder that our struggles are never isolated, that our battles and passions converge and emerge as collective action. For this, I'd like to thank Hunter Ohanian for so finely curating these 25 prints that have much to teach our community, indeed to inspire it at this political moment, and to welcome him to the University of Richmond. Hunter is Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, one of the largest LGBTQ libraries and archives in the United States. He practiced law for over a decade before shifting gears and working extensively for nonprofit arts organizations across the United States for nearly 40 years, which is hard to imagine given his robust youthfulness. Hunter was formerly Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the College Art Association, the largest art history association in the world. He was Executive Director of the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. He was the President of the Anderson Ranch Arts Center in Colorado. And he was Vice President for Institutional Advancement at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design and the Executive Director of the Massachusetts College of Art and Design Foundation. For the past decade, he has focused his labor and attention on LGBTQ content that brings queer history and culture to wider audiences, including through his work as museum director of the Leslie Lawman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art and as the executive director of the Leslie Lawman Gay Art Foundation in New York City. He has recently finished work as a curatorial consultant for an exhibition at the University of Maryland about the work of Amos Badisher, which looks fantastic, and I invite you all to join me on a road trip to see it later this month. And he is currently working on a book about Amos's photographs. In all of these many respects, Hunter has become part of the queer legacies he brings to us tonight. It is an honor to have him here. Please help me to warmly welcome Hunter Ohanian.
Good evening, everyone. That was really amazing. I'm not dead yet. It's, I'm a very fortunate guy. I have been able to do a lot of things in my professional life, and I think particularly as an open gay man, it's been nice to be able to have different jobs and responsibilities and being able to work in the visual arts field, and more recently in the archival field. I have found that to be really very important, and I just encourage all of you who, as you make your way, whether you're in school now or whether you're quote-unquote retired, I encourage you to think about how you can really work to spend time with those things that you're very passionate about. This actually happens to be something that I care a great deal about. When I was going to college and at Boston College, studying painting in the studio arts department in the mid-70s, I couldn't imagine I would become an expert on LGBTQ history when I was actually afraid to go to a gay bar down the street. And so times do change. And so it's just important that it is a journey for all of us. And for me, it really has been a journey as well, too. And so it's just great to be able to present all this work. I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Isa and Heather and the entire team at the Harnett Museum who did a great job putting this exhibition together. Once I finish with the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. There are a couple of speakers here, or microphones here. And also, there'll be a reception afterwards at the museum as well, too. So let me grab a sip of water, and we'll get going. Robert Giard was born in 1939, and he was raised in a working-class Franco-American neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. This photo of him is by a lesbian artist by the name of T. Corinne, and you should look her up. Very wonderful artist. She instead of histories, she did many herstories. He went to public high school in Connecticut in the mid-1950s, and this was again, remember the period. It was right after World War II, and that plays a significant part of this story. The Lavender Menace is something that gripped the United States in the 1950s. Now, a lot of us know about McCarthyism and the hunt for communists, but when the government changed from FDR in the brief period of Harry Truman and then to Dwight Eisenhower, it was the first time a Republican had been in the White House for many years. The left-leaning attributes of the Democratic leaders at the time sort of turned a blind eye in many ways toward members of the homosexual community to serve in government. When the Republican administration changed and the Eisenhower administration came in, a number of things happened. For the first time, you could not be a homosexual and work for the federal government. There was an actual rule that said you could not do it. And what they said publicly was it was to rid the country of communists, because post-World War II, of course, the communists were the bad guys and the villains at the time, and they didn't really want to discuss homosexuals, but what they wanted to do was get rid of them. And so the Lavender Menace was a way in which they actually were able to create feelings of insecurity for gay people. This was at a time in the 1950s where virtually every state in the country had a law that said same-sex actions were illegal and that it was considered to be perversion or it was deviant behavior. You couldn't even at this time have a bar in which gay people would go to. It was against the law for people to congregate in one particular place. Now, many of the dives and the bars that gay people, lesbians and gay men went to, or drag bars at the time, they were allowed to stay open, and only because they were controlled usually by organized crime, and also the police would look the other way, and they would just raid those at the times that they wanted to raid them. It was also a time in which the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a personality disorder. It was a disease. It wasn't until 1973 that actually that changed. But this is the environment that Robert grew up in. And as one born in 1955, I can attest to the fact that in the 60s and 70s, of course, this was an environment that many of us were involved in. And it permeated the entire environment around you. You saw no good role models for LGBTQ individuals. And it was something in which there was really nothing out there to be able to say that it was okay or that there was nothing wrong. People didn't need acceptance, but they just simply needed to be told that it wasn't wrong. He went on to study literature and theater at Yale. He did his graduate work at Boston University, and he first focused on literary authors, Walt Whitman, Willa Cather, Gertrude Stein, Marcel Proust. Later, he focused on more contemporary authors of the time, Gore Vidal, James Baldwin, Christopher Isherwood, Rita Mae Brown. In the late 60s, he moved to New York and he began to teach at the progressive and experimental New Lincoln School. Now, in addition to his interest in literature, he developed a very early interest in film and photography. And at Yale, in his undergraduate years, he was head of the Film Society there. After he graduated, he had a number of reviews and film criticisms published. He started making films himself, or started making images himself in 1972. And here are some of the artists who influenced him at that time. So here you're looking at the work of Bill Brandt from 1957. George Platt Lynes, of course, was a major influence of this particular time. Now, this is a little bit of a cheat because these 1949 male studies of George Platt Lynes would probably not have been available to him in the 70s. They were not made available until later. But there was also so much going on underground that one does not necessarily know where people were getting their images. But I want to acknowledge that this may not have been there. But he was clearly a fan of George Platt Lynes. Joseph Sudik, of course. Now you see the black and white in here, and you see the still life here. This is, of course, a still life after Caravaggio. Again, he was very influenced by this work. Somebody who came on the scene, of course, and changed a lot in the 1970s was Robert Mapplethorpe. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with Mapplethorpe's work, there is, in addition to so much of the figurative work and the politically arousing work, there's also his beautiful still lifes and his flowers as well, too. And his sense of composition was absolutely amazing. He was also a fan of another personal favorite of mine, Peter Hujar. And here you see Peter's portrait of David Wojnarowicz. And again, for those of you who are interested in queer art from that period of time, from the period in the late 70s, and if you have not seen either one of these names of David Wojnarowicz or Peter Hujar, these are makers that you really should focus on and be able to spend some time in understanding their work. So to look at some of his work at the same time, there we go. This is a piece of his called Man in Headdress. And now this is from 1978. And looking at this piece and looking at the other influences that he had at the time, you can begin to divine where some of his references were coming from. He was shooting on film, and he was making silver gelatin prints that he was developing and printing himself. So 1978, Man in Headdress. And then this is Man with Marionette, also from 1978. His use of shadow and light in these is extraordinary. And but by the way, as I said, he had gone to Yale, and all of his papers and his photographs are at the Beinecke Library at Yale, and they are available for those who are interested in studying them. This is his partner at the time, who's still alive today, Jonathan Sillen. This is John and Arthur, 1979. And Aquatic Bathroom. I love this piece. The light in this piece is really sort of spectacular. It's so playful. I think you did a great job. Next one is the, sorry, we skipped one here. This is the artist Newt McMahon. And here you're seeing how he's working some of the figurative work in here. And you're going to see that again as well too. But he's working to be able to show the whole human and the individual who they are in their situ. And he wants to be able to present that individual to you. Whoops, sorry. My trigger finger's a little, okay. He did a fair amount of landscape work as well too. And again, this harkens back to some of the other work that we saw. This is called Bare Hedge in 1981. And this is the poet George Strambolian in 1984. Beautiful pieces. Now, as many people know, AIDS was something which affected many people in the United States, and certainly the gay male community in the 1980s were profoundly affected by it. It was in 1981 that the first article showed up in the New York Times that said that this mysterious disease had killed 44 people in Los Angeles and 22 people in New York, and they actually called it a gay cancer at the time. It was sort of a very bizarre situation. And so for the first few years of AIDS, many people had no idea what was going on. It was just that if you got it, it was a death sentence. There was no way out of it. And that went on for quite a few years, well into the 80s. But finally, if you figure that AIDS first hit the Times in 81, and then you imagine stories about this gay cancer started showing up in gay newspapers like The Blade and The Advocate and those newspapers by late 82 into 83. By 85, you see the first dramatic representation about what it was like to be suffering from AIDS, suffering from this disease that nobody knew anything about and that they were going to die. And so the activist and artist Larry Kramer wrote a play called The Normal Heart. And so Robert and his partner John went to see the original production of The Normal Heart in New York at that time in 85. And what he decided at the time was that he wanted to use what he had developed as a skill. He saw what was happening around the United States. For those of you who remember Life magazine, who are old enough to remember how information was communicated at this time, this is what we were all wrapped up in at the time. But he wanted to be able to do something about the community. He wanted to, as he said, record something of note of our experience, history, and culture. And as a result, he ended up making more than 500 portraits of LGBTQ writers and LGBTQ historians. It was his way of giving back. So he started this work in 1985, being moved by seeing the play, and he made it continuously until 2002 when he died of a heart attack at the very young age. So what we're going to do is there are 25 images of LGBTQ and queer pioneers which I've selected from his work. And so what I want to be able to do is use these to actually talk about gay civil rights in the 20th century in the United States. And just to back up for a minute, we have to remember that prejudice and discrimination against LGBTQ people, or even before that name even existed, people who just practiced same-sex practices. That practice has been going on since early times, the Roman days. I mean, there's some cave in France they found drawings that they believe 40 years ago. Why is it they always find a cave in France that they find these things in? But there is a long history of same-sex attraction. It didn't really have a name until relatively recently in the course of Western civilization, because it didn't actually get a name. The word homosexuality did not even develop until the late 1800s. It was a German that actually created the word homosexual, and then the word heterosexual was created after that. So yet another binary had to be created. It was the idea that up until that point, It was a practice or an inclination that people had to have a same-sex attraction, or to have what you might call a non-heteronormative attraction. And it was approved of, or it was blessed, or it wasn't blessed. Certainly the Catholic Church did a tremendous amount post the 12th century to say that it was a sin. There was a lot of morality put around it. It was very transactional. It was the idea that, it's so funny when, I live in Florida now, in Fort Lauderdale, and, we have this crazy guy. He's a governor. I don't know what his name is, but he signed this law that says that you can't say gay in front of an elementary school kid. Well, you can't say straight. You can't say that here is a mom and a dad who are married to each other, but there's something wrong about saying two women are a couple. The reason why they're not mature enough to handle that information is the speaker is saying he's looking at a particular sexual act. We're reduced to sexual acts as opposed to when a 5-year-old child meets a husband and wife who are other kids' parents. They don't think about a sexual act. They think this is someone's mommy and daddy. And when a 5-year-old meets a gay couple, there's nothing wrong that they can't just simply be saying he has two daddies or he has two moms. If somebody thinks there's a problem with that, the problem is in what they're putting on, what they're projecting on the individual. And that's the point where we are today. And of course, and that's why this stuff is so important in this story. But anyway, so to rush through the 19th century, of course, it was a very rural economy at the time. Many people lived on farms and in the exurbs at the time. And then in the beginning part of the 20th century, people began to move toward the cities. And post-Civil War, of course, city growth really happened. And there were centers in New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, in which people were able to find like-minded individuals who were queer folk at the time. And one of the places that there were people, that there were a lot of gay people, was in the Harlem neighborhood in New York, and there was what was known as the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, it was a place in which you had two groups of individuals that were marginalized by society at the time. Blacks were being marginalized, and the deviants, the homosexuals, were being marginalized as well. So they were able to hook up and to be out in front of each other at that time. So Mabel Hampton, in the 1920s, this photograph of her was made, it says undated, but it's 1989. In the 1920s, she, at the age of 17, she was a singer and a dancer at the Harlem Theater at that time. And she began performing in Coney Island, and then she moved to the larger theaters in Harlem. In the 70s, Hampton was one of the founders of the Lesbian History Archives in New York City, which is obviously an essential community space and a vast collection of documents about lesbian history, culture, and it's now located in Park Slope. This is Edith Ide, and I like Edith because she was a little bit tricky, I guess. This was made in 1997, but in 1947, she was working for RKO Pictures in California, and she was a young, closeted lesbian. She had her circle of friends, and in 1947, she created a publication called Vice Versa. And it was typewritten. She typed the whole thing, and she basically wrote the whole thing as well too. And it's very funny. If you go online, you can find copies of it. And it says, please be sure to send me your stories. But there was no address anywhere on any of the publications, so you didn't actually know how to send them to her. But the indication is the fact that it would only be communicated by hand, and that it had to be person to person, because it was so dangerous that you might get caught handing out a publication that had lesbian poetry in it. I mean, and we think about things that are happening today, and we think about that being part of what was going on. It's pretty astonishing. But Ide's claim to fame is that she created the first LGBTQ publication in the 20th century in 1947. I also like her because her pseudonym was Lisa Ben, and so she obviously liked word play as she did that. Next, we have Harry Hay and John Burnside. So Harry Hay is sitting down there, and he was the founder of the Mattachine Review and the Mattachine Society. And the Mattachine Society was definitely a response to the McCarthyism and the Lavender Menace at the time. And the publication, you see the May 1959 one there, but there were no photographs, there were just illustrations, and it was just talking about civil rights and what was wrong with the American system with regard to its approach toward homosexuality at the time. He's shown here with his longtime partner, the inventor John Burnside, he finally moved away from Mattachine, probably in the 70s or 80s, because he opposed the efforts to move the LGBTQ community into a mainstream acceptance. There were many people who felt the way to gain acceptance would be assimilation. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about gay marriage for that reason. There are many people who feel, of course, it's great that gay marriage exists, but then there are many queer people who actually don't want to get married because they simply don't want to be part of what that institution is. But that fight was going on at that time. This is Jim Kempner, and he was a member of the Communist Party, and he also worked at the Mattachine Society. One of the important things about Jim is that he was sort of the ultimate pack rat, and he was on all of the committees of the Mattachine Society and the various chapters, and so he preserved all of the records, the minutes, the agendas, and everything else. And you know, people say sometimes that the last act of activism is archives, and I think it's a really important thing that the fact that what happens is actually recorded is a major piece in being able to make that happen. So all of his papers are at the one archive at USC. This is Stormy de la Rey, and working as a drag king, MC, and performer for the Traveling Jewel Box Review in the 1950s and 60s. He was a self-identified butch lesbian. The Jewel Box Review was one of the few racially integrated drag shows. It traveled throughout the United States, often playing the Apollo Theater in New York's Harlem neighborhood. On the evening of June 29th, 1969, de la Rey happened to be at a bar in New York called the Stonewall Inn. It was in Greenwich Village's. It was in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, and the bar is still there today. It was a bar which had attracted many drag queens, gays, hippies, and other people on the sides of society. It was owned by the mafia, and it was often raided by the New York Police Department. On that night, on June 29, 1969, a typical raid occurred, and the outcome was anything different than what had normally happened. As de la Rey later said, "When the cop hit me, I hit back. The cops got what they gave." As a result, a melee occurred outside of the bar that night and for the following 3 weekends, and the modern-day LGBTQ movement was founded. It's one of those movements in which, with Stonewall, of course, everybody knows the word Stonewall, although not everybody knows all the history about it, but it was truly a moment in a bar that the police decided that they were just going to come in and take some money and do something that they were going to do and get paid off. And people finally said no. It was a period of time in which in 1969, of course, we saw inroads being made in the civil rights movement. Women saw many inroads being made with regard to their rights. And a group of on-the-edge gay people said, you know what, we're just not going to take it anymore. And it was a time which actually changed how we think about everything today. This is Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin. They were two women who were behind the publication The Ladder. And The Ladder was put out by the Daughters of Bilitis. And so going back a little bit to the 1950s, it was similar to the Mattachine Society. And so the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis worked together. Together they created something known as the homophile movement, which was really trying to protect those interested in a queer lifestyle. They had seminars together, they had workshops and conferences, and it was a wonderful publication. If you can find a copy of these, you can get them. You probably have them in your library here as well, I bet too, but they're definitely worth looking at. Another one was the One magazine, and here you see the publisher Dore Legg. And Dore played a very important role in all this. In 1957, One magazine was the first magazine that you could actually get a subscription to. So again, we're talking 1950s. And so what did it mean if you got a subscription? The other ones were sold on newsstands or in adult bookstores or those kind of things. To get a subscription, it had to go through the mail. And if it went through the U.S. mail, the federal government decided that the contents were obscene simply because of the subject matter that was in. Now again, we're not talking about any photographs, we're not talking about erotic stories, we're talking about political discourse. And so the post office decided that they could not send it through the mail. And so Dore Legg is the one who sued the United States Post Office. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they voted 7-2 to allow the publication to go through the mail, and that it was not obscene. There's still some of us who can remember the fact that things would come in plain brown envelopes, or you even know what that means, and the sense that people were truly afraid of sending things that you would actually, if you were on either end of that receiving chain, that you could get in trouble for it, even though it had been overturned by the Supreme Court. Here we see Frank Kameny in his house in Washington, D.C., and Frank was one of the leading figures of the gay civil rights movement. When he was 32, he was fired from his position as an astronomer in the U.S. Army's mapping service because he was gay. He sued to get his job back, and he did not win. But that episode led to a life of activism. In the 1960s, he was involved in the Washington chapter of the Mattachine Society, and he fought to change the sodomy laws, which are prohibitions against same-sex intimate relations. I've mentioned, of course, the fact that it was illegal for gay people to congregate together, but actually having sexual relations was illegal in most states as well, too. In 1971, he was the first openly gay person to run for the U.S. Congress. He did not win that election, but of course the importance of that is the fact that he was the first person to do it. And today, through the years, we've had over 30 members of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives be open homosexuals, and that's not to mention all of those in local and state governments throughout the United States, where before it would not even be possible. Here you see Barbara Giddings and Kay Lassen, and they were very involved in the Daughters of Bilitis as well. Barbara, you see in that image on the right, you see her holding the sign there that says homosexuals should be judged as individuals. Here she is picketing in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and she was also part of a group that picketed in front of the White House. So they publicly put themselves out there to protest the laws and what were going on. Again, true pioneers at that time. This is Craig Rodwell, and in 1967, 2 years before the Stonewall melee happened, he opened a bookstore in New York called the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, which was the first place in which LGBTQ books were able to sell fiction and nonfiction. He very intentionally did not have anything that was sexually related. He very clearly wanted to be a place for people to go, that they weren't going to be marginalized in that way that I was talking about before, that they were going to be sexualized in that way. So, of course, through the 70s and 80s, there were many gay bookstores. I am saddened at the fact that there aren't as many gay bookstores today as there used to be. And, again, this is the price of assimilation. I was in Barnes & Noble recently, and I was looking for some topics, and I said, do you have a gay section? And they said, oh, no, not anymore. Yeah, you can find them in the biography section, or you can find them. And so they have been assimilated into the subjects in which they are in certain bookstores. I find that a little sad. I find it sad not to be an 18 or 22-year-old and wanting to go into a bookstore and feel that there would be a nice shelf of books that would be dealing what I found to be important at the time. And it's almost as if you need another index in order to be able to find them in a bookstore like that. That may change again. In other bookstores, I think less corporate ones might have a more open attitude about it. But it's interesting how times have changed with this. But anyway, so obviously opening the first gay bookstore was important. But then if you look at the companion image here, you see the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day flag in 1970. Now, Stonewall happened, the melee happened where hundreds of people came out of the streets in 1969. This is the very first Pride Parade. And so this is what it was called. He was one of the principal organizers of it, where they decided that they were going to march that time in June as the first year anniversary of what had happened at the Stonewall Inn the year before. The name changed and to the name that it is today. Christopher Street was used simply because it is on Christopher Street. And of course there was a large gay community there in that part of of New York. Last count that I saw, over 30,000, no, I take that back, 2 million people at the last New York City Pride, and over 30 million people worldwide attend gay pride events. So it's astonishing to think that, from an idea, from something that happened at the Stonewall Inn, that I'm going to punch back, I'm going to give them what they gave me, and then we're going to do something, has 50 years or 52 years later, has millions and millions of people who are following that quest for civil rights. This is Jonathan Ned Katz. Jonathan's still alive today, making wonderful artwork. And his book, Gay American History, was important because it came out in 1976, which we celebrated the bicentennial. And this was was Reagan president during the bicentennial? Was that Reagan or was it Ford? I forget. Ford? Yeah. So, this is like back in the dark ages for us, but thankfully. but of course there was, so much Americana. Queen Elizabeth was here, and the bicentennial was a major phenomenon in the United States. But at the same time, the first Gay American History came out. And it was the first comprehensive, fully researched source that chronicled the history of homosexuality in America. And it included the book is organized around multiple topics, including legal and physical threats faced by the LGBTQ population, the rise of American gay subculture in the late 19th century, and for those interested in gay subculture in the 19th century, it's a great resource, as well as attempts to cure and treat homosexuality as a disease. This is Sylvia Rivera. She was a transgender and gay liberation activist who was born in New York to a Puerto Rican father and a Venezuelan mother. She identified as male at birth with the name Raymond. She was abandoned by her parents, and by the time she was 3. She lived with a grandmother who disapproved of her assumption of female attributes, and as a result, she began living on the streets at the age of 10 and became a sex worker. Her activism is obviously well documented. Along with Marsha P. Johnson, they started an organization called Street Transvestites Against Revolutionaries, and they were some of the first trans activists out there. And as the Stonewall juggernaut was moving along, both Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were definitely part of what was going on. Today, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project provides legal aid to low-income people of color and/or who are transgender, intersex, or gender nonconforming. This is Joan Nessel. Joan has worn many hats in the lesbian community: activist, writer, editor, community historian. As a Jewish lesbian feminist, she participated in several important intersectional social movements of her day, including anti-war, women's rights, gay liberation, and pro-sex movements. She was also one of the founders of the Lesbian History Archives. This is John Boswell, and recognizing that same-sex unions existed in the Roman Catholic Church up to the 12th century, but thereafter the Church villainized members of the gay community. Boswell, a devoted Catholic and eminent historian and scholar, examined how organized religions, especially the Roman Catholic Church, rejected homosexuals for centuries, right up to the present day. Boswell's seminal work, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality in 1980, helped many LGBTQ plus individuals better understand prejudice within their own religion. Up until his book, there have been no academic works on the study of homosexuality and the Catholic Church. He unfortunately died of AIDS in 1994. Pat Parker, of course, many people know her work, a poet, activist, and educator. She was involved with the Black Panthers and the Black Women's Revolutionary Council. She moved to Oakland, California in the early 1970s to pursue writing and potential opportunities for activist work. In 1980, she founded the Black Women's Revolutionary Council, leading her to a career of activism for gay and lesbian organizations. In particular, she was concerned about the rights of people of color and those who suffer from domestic violence. Here we see two powerhouses, Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith. A self-described Black lesbian, mother, warrior, and poet, Lorde dedicated both her life and her creative talent to confronting and addressing the injustices of sexism, classism, and homophobia. She was a poet from an early age. She rose to have an esteemed career as a writer and an educator. She was an early and continuing contributor to the development of feminist theory, critical race studies, and queer studies. Barbara Smith, who is alive today and still working, is also a scholar, an activist, author, and educator. She is credited with having coined the term identity politics. Having grown up in a segregated society, Smith developed a political consciousness early in life. And as an adult, let me just see if I can, whoops, sorry. She was dedicated to illuminating bias arising among class, race, and gender, and again identifying intersectionality early on, going back to the 1980s. Here we again see two more powerhouses. Here you see Larry Kramer, and this was taken in 1989. He was an author, an activist, an essayist, and a playwright, and he was responsible for that play I was talking about in the beginning, The Normal Heart. He was also the founder of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was the first service organization to help HIV-positive individuals in New York. And he was also one of the founders of ACT UP, which was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And again, if ACT UP is a new term to you, it's something you definitely should look up and be able to understand the power of what ACT UP was about and its role at the time. You also see Sarah Schulman, and again, she's teaching today at the City University of New York in Staten Island, a novelist, journalist, playwright, and educator. She spent a career organizing in women's, gay liberation, and AIDS activist movements. She created the ACT UP Oral History Project, and her most recent book, which is the history of the ACT UP movement, all of the oral histories there, is a wonderful compilation of what happened in the 80s, 90s, and early aughts with regard to the ACT UP movement. Here we see Mariano Romo Carmano and June Chan, who were a couple. Mariana was a prolific writer, theorist, and educator. She was the founder of Las Buenas Amigas, the first Latina lesbian organization. Its formation in the 1980s offered an opportunity to address the invisibility of the intellectual production by Latina lesbians. It also provided a safe space by offering education, social support, and political organization. Her partner at the time, June Chan, co-founded the Asian Lesbians of the East Coast in response to the primarily white male leadership of the existing LGBTQ plus organizations. Here you see the other country's collective, Rodney Dildy, David Frechette, Colin Robinson, Carlos Segura, and David Woods. This literary and advocacy group was founded in 1986 to provide a voice to Black queer writers who had been underrepresented by institutional and social endeavors relevant to the experience of Black gay men. These goals were archived through publishing, live performances, writing, and educational workshops and outreach to underserved communities. If you have an opportunity to pick up one of the journals called Sojourner, it's not published anymore, but it's a wonderful anthology of Black queer writing. Oh, here you see Gloria. She's best known for assembling ideas around feminism, spirituality, lesbianism, Chicana culture, and critical issues related to the Chicana experience, including heteronormativity, colonialism, and male dominance. She grew up on the Texas-Mexico border. She self-identified as a feminist, and her major works are often associated with Chicana feminism and post-colonial feminism. Urvashi Viad was a wonderful leader. She's the former director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and she led a national movement for gay civil rights, including fighting for AIDS support and prison reform. Upon her death last year or the year before, 2022, the leader of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force called her one of the most influential progressive activists of our time. She has been a champion, or had been a champion of LGBTQ rights from her college days. She insisted that freedom for gay men and lesbians required fighting for gender, racial, and economic equality as well. As head of the task force in the 1980s, she was one of the most vocal and visible figures in the push against institutional LGBTQ discrimination, and she was a major force behind the marches on Washington, which began in 1979. Here we see Holly Hunter, and Holly Hunter is here, is teaching today at the University of Michigan. And Holly was one of the NEA4, and she was one of the ones, along with Karen Finley and Tim Miller, and I forget that the last one, actually had their NEA awards taken away from them because there was gender-specific work in their content in their work. And it was at a period in time in the late 1980s in which it was the second brush up with the NEA problem. The first one was a few years earlier where Republican conservative politicians, Jesse Helms, Ron D'Amato, they fought against an exhibition of work by Robert Mapplethorpe, The Perfect Moment, and then also Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. And so it was exactly the same thing that we see today. We see all the underpinnings of this. I'm just kind of waiting for somebody to have a demonstration, a conservative demonstration against a talk like this, because this is what we're seeing today in various states in which they're saying that this is not proper. But Holly Hunter was in the second group, the NEA4. They had all of their NEA awards stripped from them. And the important thing that lives with us today, those of you in the room who are old enough to remember the role of the NEA, everybody from Grace Paley to Bill Jones and all these individuals received great awards. After the NEA4, an act of Congress was passed which it said they can no longer give out individual artist awards. And so they do not exist today because of this standard that you had to have respect for diverse beliefs of the American public had to be protected. So that somehow we are protecting a certain group of diverse beliefs, but we're not protecting everybody's. But today, a major national recognition of the individual artist is no longer exists, and it hasn't been in place for over 30 years. which is astonishing that this is the result of what can happen. Lastly, I want to leave with Leslie Feinberg and Minnie Bruce Platt. Leslie Feinberg wrote the book Stone Butch Blues, which I think for many lesbians and members of the trans community, this was a transformative book. It is published in I don't know how many languages now, all over the world. And it has truly, I think, it became again a stonewall of sorts for many people to come out as trans and being able to understand that they can address their own sexual issues and their own identities with regard to gender. And so let me stop there. I'll have another sip of water here because for some reason I'm getting very dry here. But and so I'd be curious to know what people's comments and questions. I think we're doing okay on time. Yep. And what kind of responses that people have. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. This was amazing. I was wondering about all the pictures are in black and white. People also talk about how like color coexist instead, so that pictures in these eras are like always shown black and white. Do you think that has any influence on like how we contend with these issues?
Interesting question. So the question is, why are the pictures but black and white, and then also does it affect how we relate to them? So many artists, of course, like to work in black and white, and others like to work in color. This particular artist liked black and white, and so in seeing some of his inspiration, you could see that's what he was inspired by. Personally, from an aesthetic standpoint, I do think black and white photographs, whether they're figurative or portraiture or landscape, are far more powerful. I think the shadow is incredibly powerful. And so this was the artist's own desire with regard to it, but I think they're very powerful as a result of it. But he did not work in color, but by choice. Other questions? Yes? If I understand the question, did he set up the backgrounds? Yeah. So what he did, he took these 500 portraits over 15 years, and so he was literally trying to get and have people sit for him and take these portraits. So the majority of the portraits are in the individual's homes, and so you're seeing there, or else they're on their property, and so he has pretty extensive notes about what the visit was like, and he would be there for several hours, and then they would make a decision. The one of Sarah Schulman, for example, is on the roof of his building in New York. The one with Edith Ide is at her house in California, and so he would just go to those places and take them in situ like that, which I think make them very charming, and they also make a great range of different things, and so he got to use whatever props that he wanted to use with them. The question was asked earlier today, which I think is interesting. It's always interesting when you look at photographers' archives, that these are the pictures that the artist chose to print shortly after he took those photographs. But in that shoot, there might have been 50, 100 other images, which he might not have printed all of them, but certainly all the film had been developed in most cases. So what is interesting now is being able to go through the negatives and see what pictures weren't printed. It does get a little bit tricky in the sense that here we see the artist's voice. The artist is making the declaration that this is what they wanted that final image to look like. But there are also plenty other images for us to unearth and to play archivist with and see interesting things that are there. That's why I tell all of you, if any of you are art makers, don't throw anything away. Just keep absolutely every possible thing that you have, because all of that stuff is very important to those of us who care to learn about this stuff in the future. Yes? I don't fully know why, but he did not have a strong exhibition schedule. He didn't have a gallery, and he didn't have any kind of representation at the time. And I think that was probably by his own desire. These photographs were made, and people knew he was making them, and one connection would lead to the next connection, because he was contacting people who had big profiles out there, who were allowing him to come into their house to do it. And so he was moving as fast as he could. But I don't believe his work was well recognized until the late 90s. He did a book of his photographs called Personal Voices, I believe is the name of it. And MIT Press did the book. It was a self-published book, though, even though MIT Press did it. So there was still, it was difficult for him to find an audience at that time. I know of no gallery representation. There is a gallery now that represents the estate, but I don't think his work was widely distributed. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Of the 500 portraits, you were only able to include about 25.
Yeah.
Why specifically for these 25 did you choose to include them? And were there any from the other collection that you really wish would have made it in?
Great question. So it's the reality. So somebody asked me today, well, how come there's no Harvey Milk? And how come there's, and so, but the point is, it's truly just of what this artist made. So that was the first limitation of doing a show of his work, was based upon what he did. But the second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to use his work and to test the viability of using his work to tell that entire arc of a story that I just told you about LGBTQ history. So I pulled individuals out. For example, John Boswell, in his book about religion, it's an important point to put him in there because it's the place where we get to talk about religion. There are places that we get to talk about different people. And so that's part of what a curator gets to do, is sort of pull these in to tell a bigger arc of a story here. You can go to the Beinecke Library website to see more of these. It's all free, and you can even download beautiful images of them as well, too. I don't think there was any that I wanted to put in that I didn't put in. And I think as I thought about the exhibition, this exhibition has 25 large but black and white images in there, and hopefully people will come and see it. I know we can go there now, and they're going to have a little reception for all of us, so you're all welcome to come over there. But it's also just space limitations and size and sort of moving it in that way. I do feel it's a good representative sampling of his craft and also his vision of a portrait. I mean, he wrote that a portrait, as I said before, that a portrait is a look at the present. And I think that that's really very true. This is, you see the presence of these individuals at that time. And some of them, in the settings and the clothing, they might look a little dated to you. But that's okay. They were portraits of that particular time, and they had that style. And there's an honesty to his work. There's an earnestness, which I think is really good. Other questions? Comments? Well, thank you all for coming out here. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you go and read some more about Robert. And we would love for all of you to come to the museum at the Motlin Center. And thank you to Isa and the staff there for doing everything.